You hear them before you see them. A low, throaty murmur swells from the trees, part wind, part voice, echoing through the forest like breath drawn from the lungs of the earth itself. The night is dense, thick with fog that clings to the branches like cobwebs spun by something ancient. Overhead, the moon hangs low and swollen, spilling its pale light through cracks in the blackened canopy, turning the moss below silver and slick. You step quietly between twisted trunks, your feet sinking into cold earth softened by decay. The air tastes of smoke and damp leaves, of pine resin and something sharper, burned herbs, perhaps. Blood, maybe. It's impossible to know. Then you see them. A ring of fire. 12 torches planted in a perfect circle, flames snapping low and steady in the windless clearing. Beyond the firelight, shadows, still and silent. Figures cloaked in dark wool, hoods drawn, masks hiding every face. Stag antlers. A crow's beak. A skull polished smooth. They do not speak. They do not move. But they watch. At the center of the ring, 2 children stand bare beneath the moonlight. A boy and a girl, young enough that their limbs still move with hesitation, still shaped by innocence. Ash smudges mark their chests in crude circles. A cord of red wool ties their wrists together, symbolic, ceremonial, or binding, you cannot tell. They tremble, but not from cold. The wind does not reach here. The girl's eyes are fixed on the ground. The boy's jaw is clenched, not in defiance, but dread. Between them, a shallow pit lined with rushes has been carved into the earth. At its center, a bowl, simple, earthen, filled with something black that reflects no light. It smells sharp. Metallic. Unclean. One of the masked figures steps forward. No words are spoken. Only movement. Measured, practiced. The figure reaches into the bowl and marks the children with 2 fingers. Shoulder, chest, stomach, the space between the hips. The blackness stains their skin like ink spilled on parchment. A low chant begins, slow and deliberate. It starts with 1 voice. Then 3. Then 9. A rhythmic pulse carried on breath and bone, too old for understanding. You feel it in your chest, behind your eyes, in the pit of your gut. The cadence is neither joyful nor mournful. It is something older. Something inevitable. The children lower themselves into the pit. The fire casts shadows across their bodies, flickering silhouettes that dance over the trees like spirits fleeing into the canopy. The chanting continues. The masked figures begin to sway. Hands rise. Heads tilt back. One begins to rock side to side, humming now through the mask. Another holds a fistful of dried herbs over the fire until it crackles and sparks. The boy lies down first. The girl follows. Their hands remain bound. They do not look at each other. Their breathing is shallow. The chant reaches its peak. This is not hidden. This is not secret. This is witnessed. You look away, and yet you cannot move. Every instinct tells you this moment is wrong. And yet, around you, every figure stands still in perfect silence, heads bowed not in shame, but reverence. Above, the trees creak like old bones. The wind returns. You know, without being told, that this ritual is older than the village. Older than the chapel. Older than sin. There are no priests here. No relics. No gospel. Only earth, fire, flesh, and memory. And stillness. Because this, what you are seeing, was never meant to be questioned. This wasn't a crime. It was custom. The fire in the clearing has gone out, but its heat lingers in the soil like a buried memory. Smoke coils into the branches, dispersing into the mist. The masked figures vanish into the dark without a word, leaving the pit behind, now cold, now still. The forest reclaims its silence, as if nothing had ever happened. But that ritual, the one you just witnessed, was not an anomaly. It was part of a vast network of forbidden traditions, older than kings, older than scripture. Customs carved into the bones of villages long before the first cathedral bell rang. And though the church tried to erase them, root and stem, they endured. They called it heresy, blasphemy, devil's work. But to the villagers, it was survival. In the remote valleys of Wales, in the crumbling hill towns of the Pyrenees, and in the icy woods of Eastern Europe, ancient rites clung to the people like soot to stone. Not in defiance of the church, but in spite of it. These were not public rebellions. They were whispered continuities, performed in barns after Mass, in meadows at dusk, under full moons when the fields needed blessing and the wombs needed filling. During the solstice festivals, those sacred turning points between dark and light. Entire communities gathered in torchlit circles. Not to pray, but to act. Sacred sex was not considered sin. It was renewal. The old belief was simple: if the earth was to bear fruit, so must the bodies that lived upon it. Couples would be chosen, sometimes newlyweds, sometimes strangers. They would lie together in specially prepared, blessing beds, at the center of village feasts, surrounded by drumming, dancing, and chanting. Children would be kept away, but elders watched, not to shame, but to affirm. The act was symbolic, meant not to titillate, but to stir the slumbering soil. One thrust for wheat. Another for barley. A third for rain. At Beltane in the Highlands, young men wore the antlered masks of the Green Man, an ancient god of growth, lust, and decay. Wreaths of ivy, ash, and wildflowers were bound to their waists. They would chase the young women through fields in ritual hunts that ended in union, breathless and muddy beneath the stars. No one spoke of love. This was not romance. It was necessity, wrapped in myth. And then there were the plow blessings. In early spring, before the first seed touched the soil, farmers brought their tools into the village chapel, not to pray over them, but to seduce them. Yes. Seduce. The plowshare was cleaned and oiled. Then, in front of a gathered crowd, a young virgin. Sometimes a chosen bride, sometimes a girl of lower standing, would sit astride the shaft as if astride a man. She would ride it slowly, chanting rhymes older than Latin, her movements slow, her voice trembling as the people around her clapped in rhythm. When the ritual ended, her hair would be bound in red ribbon and buried in the field's edge. Her sweat and song offered to the crops. Her virginity surrendered not to a man, but to the land. The church called these practices perversions. They sent friars and inquisitors to silence them. But rites do not die easily. They survive in story, in gesture, in the tremble of a girl's hand as she traces an old sigil on a stable door. They linger in old songs with verses skipped during Massachusetts. In lullabies with forgotten meanings. And now, they survive here. In your ears. If this part of history vanishes because you scroll past without subscribing, who will remember them? We are the only whisper left for their story. You're standing at the edge of another chamber now, not a forest clearing, but a stone cottage lit by a single candle. It's the night after the wedding, and the door is bolted shut from the outside. Not to protect the couple within, but to ensure they cannot leave until the task is done. The sheets are white. The girl is silent. The man, twice her age, removes his belt with the detached precision of someone trained not in love, but in duty. There is no one here but them. And yet, it feels like the entire village is watching. Because they are. Outside, the elders drink heavily. Women with red cheeks and clenched jaws wait beside the cottage wall. One of them holds a basket filled with salt, vinegar, and a folded cloth. Another has a name written in chalk on a slate. It's the girl's name. It will be erased or preserved depending on what happens next. Inside, the bride lies stiff on the bed. Not from modesty, but terror. She knows what's expected. Not pleasure. Not even obedience. Blood. Virginity, in her world, is not a condition of anatomy. It is a public currency. Her value lies not in her voice, or mind, or laughter, but in a membrane the priests describe as a seal, as if God himself installed it there to be broken on a schedule. The pain is expected. The blood is required. And if it doesn't appear, there are remedies. A vial of ox blood hidden in the sleeve of a nightgown. A pinch to the thigh with a hidden thorn to draw a dot of red. If that fails, a goose feather soaked in vinegar, inserted just before the act. All to produce a stain. A symbol. A lie that will save her life. Because if the sheet remains clean, the consequences will not. Brides have been returned to their fathers in disgrace. Their dowries demanded back. Their brothers challenged to duels. Their mothers beaten for raising a daughter, spoiled. In some provinces, girls who failed this test were drowned in wells. In others, they were paraded through town wearing a red veil of shame. To avoid this, families took precautions. Virginity certificates were issued by local priests who inspected girls before marriage. Midwives were hired not to deliver babies, but to verify hymens, poking, stretching, prodding with fingers hardened by years of livestock handling. These inspections were public events. Priests sometimes attended. Fathers watched. The girl's silence was mistaken for modesty, when it was only shock. And even if she passed, she would be watched. On her wedding night, a designated witness, usually an older cousin or aunt, might be stationed outside the room, ear to the door, waiting for sounds. If it was too quiet, suspicion followed. If it was too loud, shame. There was no right way to be a bride. Only a dangerous tightrope of performance. And this was not centuries ago in the shadow of temples. This was Europe. This was Christendom. This was the foundation of modern Western morality. All built on a lie about skin and blood and silence. You wouldn't have survived one of these tests. Neither would I. So if we get to learn this safely in 2025, hit subscribe. Or go to the comments and explain why you won't honor their memory. Now leave the muddy village behind. Step across the stone threshold of a candlelit hall, where tapestries catch the firelight and velvet-draped chairs sit empty beneath arched ceilings. Here, everything is polished, perfumed, and veiled in formality. But beneath the polished floors and the ceremonial robes lies a rot far more deliberate than anything the peasants ever knew. Because here, sex was not survival. It was strategy. Noble marriages were not made in bed. They were forged at the banquet table, between sips of wine and veiled glances, signed in treaties and measured in hectares. But once the ink dried, the bed became the battlefield. And the body, proof of political leverage. Before a groom could claim his bride, his manhood had to be tested, not with his betrothed, but with a stranger. In many courts, a chambermaid or hired prostitute was brought into a private room with the young noble. Sometimes two. Sometimes more. Their task was not to pleasure him, but to witness him. To confirm that he could rise to the occasion, perform the act, and deliver seed. In certain Italian duchies, the girl was ordered to taste and describe the emission, to declare whether it was strong, watery, or lacking force. These were not private affairs. The outcome would be recorded. Attendants might be present. Physicians might observe. The act of sex, raw, trembling, real, was placed on display like a royal jewel. And then came the ritual beddings. These were no longer for love, nor even for lust. They were rites wrapped in ancient superstition, timed to the alignments of stars and the shape of the moon. Court astrologers read charts before consummation. If Venus stood in opposition, the act was delayed. If Saturn cast a dark aspect over the groom's birth sign, the marriage was cancelled. The woman's womb, they believed, was like a field. It could be barren, or cursed. Only under proper skies would it bear fruit. So they waited. And when the skies aligned, they prepared the room with ceremony. The bed would be laced with red silks and pomegranate rinds. Vials of blood, sometimes from the bride's own arm, were dripped onto the sheets as offerings. The groom would enter veiled. The bride already lying beneath furs, perfumed with jasmine and smeared with oils intended to open the body's gates. In certain courts, especially among German princes and French lords, the couple did not consummate alone. A bishop might stand behind the curtain. An older aunt might hold the bride's hand. The midwife would inspect afterward, lifting the sheet in silence, and if blood was found, it was paraded through the great hall as proof of successful alliance. Guests would toast the stain, drinking spiced wine from silver cups, while musicians played dirges dressed as lovers. Even more disturbing were the trial intercourses. If a marriage was politically necessary but the couple were too young, or too closely related, the church required proof that the union would produce children. So, under ecclesiastical oversight, trial intercourses were performed. Cousins paired in beds lined with church-sanctioned candles. A scribe might be present to record the position. A priest to bless the act before and after. And if the girl became pregnant, the union was confirmed. The child would be raised as a living contract. Within the libraries of these noble houses, there existed books that were never shown to priests, never copied by monks. Passed between wives in secret and read by moonlight under locked doors. The secret treatise of the Rose Chamber. A forbidden text bound in calfskin, illustrated with positions deemed too indulgent for Christian bodies. It instructed women in the art of resistance and submission, of faking pain and producing pleasure. Marginal notes in Latin advised which moans to feign for maximum control, how to preserve the illusion of virginity even after dozens of encounters, and how to manipulate a nobleman through timed affection. The book was outlawed. Copies burned. But some pages survived. You've just read one. This part of history wasn't meant for peasants, nor for us. But here we are. Don't just lurk. Subscribe. Or comment below why you choose silence over scandal. Now step behind monastery walls. The air is different here. Still. Thick with incense and echoes. Footsteps disappear in the cold corridors, and candle flames flicker against stained glass saints whose eyes never close. You expect silence. You expect piety. But listen closely. There are sounds behind the chapel doors. Soft gasps. Bare skin on stone floors. And prayers not meant for heaven. Not all who wore the cloth believed that purity required abstinence. Some believed the opposite. Among the Cathars of southern France, a heretical sect that flourished in defiance of Rome, sex was not sin, it was transcendence. In underground chambers lined with salt and lime, rituals of soul-merging were performed. Participants fasted for days. They purified their bodies with bitter herbs. Then, under candlelight, they joined flesh to flesh, eyes locked, voices chanting a single phrase, "To know you is to know the divine." The climax was not an ending. It was the gateway. The moment when the soul, loosened by pleasure, could ascend. Elsewhere, among the Beguines of Flanders, celibate women who lived outside convents but under religious discipline, sex was secret. But it happened. With each other. In silence. In shadow. They called it Sister's Grace. Some wrote psalms about it, hymns disguised as poems of the soul. One spoke of a hand slipping under a robe as God's kindness awakening the womb. These writings were hidden in prayer books, burned when discovered, but copied again and again. And there were the priests. Not all abuses were acts of domination. Some were cloaked in ritual. In cloistered orders, especially among mystic sects in the Alps, orgiastic confessions took place. A young nun would kneel before the altar and confess not her sins, but her body. She would describe her dreams, her desires, her thoughts in the night. Then the priest would touch her, in silence, mimicking what she described. The idea was to exorcise temptation through enactment. The climax, they claimed, released the demon. Trial records reveal the term, sin cleansing through union. A phrase used in secret orders where men and women joined bodies to transfer their impurity into one another, then fasted, whipped themselves, and took communion as if nothing had passed. One monk wrote in his journal, "I bore her lust like a penance, so that she might rise clean again." They were caught eventually. The Inquisition found them. Torture followed. Tongues were removed. Books confiscated. But even so, the belief remained, that sexual union, when stripped of lust, could become holy. And the truth is this, for every monastery that forbade flesh, there was one that used it. For every nun who wept behind the altar, there was one who moaned into a chalice. The church denied it. The world forgot it. But the stones remember. This footage isn't in textbooks. If you're watching this and don't subscribe, ask yourself, are you just a voyeur, or a keeper of the whisper? The church may have written doctrine with quills and candles, but in the villages, power was drawn from roots, breath, and blood. Step into the earthen house of a midwife. There is no marble here, no silver candelabras. Only bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, bones in pouches, stone bowls stained red with time, and scraps of vellum tucked into the folds of her skirts, recipes, chants, charms. She is not just a healer. Not merely a birth keeper. She is priest, pharmacist, and sometimes executioner. Her altar is not in a chapel, but in the body of every woman who passes through her door. And her knowledge? Forbidden. But older than scripture. There were sexual talismans passed from hand to hand, sewn into the hems of bridal gowns or hidden beneath pillows on the wedding bed. Some were carved from stag bone, shaped like seed. Others were stones wrapped in linen soaked in menstrual blood, worn on a string between the breasts to ignite the loins of the chosen. That blood, sacred and feared, was an ingredient in countless spells. A woman scorned could collect a few drops on cloth, dry it by firelight, grind it with dried roses and mouse bones, and slip the powder into her lover's wine. Within 3 days, he would return, they said, mad with lust, confused with shame, unable to speak her name without hardening. And if he strayed again? There were sex-starving spells. Take the skin of a toad, a lock of the man's hair, and 7 black seeds. Wrap them in the woman's undergarment, bury the bundle at the threshold of his home, and chant as the moon wanes. His hunger would rot in his belly. He would lie beside other women as a corpse, incapable, ashamed, bound by a woman's will. But not all spells were cast in vengeance. There were womb-sealing rituals, used by women who could not risk pregnancy. Whether their partners were soldiers, priests, or lords, the consequence of conception was ruin, or death. So they came to the midwives, and the rituals began. A circle of salt around the feet. The burning of dried mugwort and vervain, bundled with wool dyed in the woman's own blood. A chant whispered into her left ear while her abdomen was marked with oil in a spiral that mimicked the lunar phases. The final seal, a carved symbol on the underside of her tongue, invisible except by firelight. The herbs used were dangerous. Pennyroyal to prevent implantation. Mandrake to encourage fertility or miscarriage, depending on dose. Vervain for libido, mugwort for visions, tansy for control. All held in careful balance. The difference between a love charm and a lethal dose could be the weight of a single leaf. These recipes were not written. They were spoken across generations, whispered between mothers and daughters during monthly bleeds, during labor, during the first heartbroken tears after a failed seduction. No man knew them. No priest could replicate them. Because they lived in breath. In bone. In body. And still they linger. In rural villages, in fragments of lullabies, in the names of flowers no longer spoken aloud. They are not dead. They have only gone quiet. If you've made it this far without subscribing, ask yourself, who do you think will carry these whispers when we're gone? In the shadow of the church's light, darker stories bred. You may have heard of demons with horns and hooves, but these were not the most feared. The true terror wore human faces and touched you in your sleep. They called it the incubus. He came at night, they said, through keyholes, through cracks in stone walls, on mist that slipped under doorframes. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. You felt him before you saw him. The weight on your chest. The hands that were not there. The heat that bloomed between your legs in dreams you could not confess. And when the girls woke pregnant, the explanation was clear. The incubus had come. There are records. Many. In a convent near Rouen, a novice claimed she was visited by a shining man with no eyes. She bled every morning, weeping as she prayed, until her belly began to swell. The child was born with a patch of hair on his spine and fingers that never opened. He died after a week. The nuns burned his body before sunrise. They wrote, the demon did not claim him. We did. Other cases were more violent. Women accused of lying with demons were stripped in court, inspected by priests for marks, small bruises shaped like teeth, birthmarks that resembled claw scratches, nipples darker than a nun's veil. If a woman screamed in her sleep, she was watched. If she wept without cause, she was exorcised. Some confessed. Not under torture, but willingly. Because they believed it. They believed a beast had entered them. In certain regions, goat-binding sex curses were feared above all. A spell that allowed a jealous woman to lock her lover's desire inside an animal. The ritual involved binding the man's seed in wool soaked with goat's milk, then burning it alongside a hoof or horn. The man would lose all appetite for women, except the one who held the charm. And worse still were the children. Incubus births, they were called. Babies born with black eyes. With tails. With 2 rows of teeth. These were not myths to their mothers. They were terrors held in shaking arms, nursed in silence, baptized at night without witnesses. Some were killed. Others hidden. A few lived, grew, until a single incident confirmed the fear. An animal death. A neighbor's miscarriage. A flicker of shadow where there should be none. Traveling monks recorded these tales. Not to shame the women, but to warn others. They sat by village hearths and listened to grandmothers speak in broken Latin and local tongues, their stories full of fog and fire, of dreams too vivid and lovers too strange. The monks wrote them down in the margins of Bibles, on spare parchment, tucked between pages where no one would look. But we looked. And now you know. You know that sex, in the medieval world, was not just flesh. It was shadow. It was fear. It was contact with something beyond the veil. You may dismiss it now. But when you lie in bed tonight, and the wind groans through the walls, and your limbs will not move, and your breath grows shallow, remember what they believed. And wonder why they believed it. In the towering halls of medieval power, where kings dined beneath tapestries stitched with gold thread and bishops sat beside queens with fingers stained by incense, sex was not a private act. It was a spectacle. A tool. A weapon. It was sacrifice. Step into a royal court at harvest time. The crops have failed. The soil is dry. The priests murmur of sin. The villagers whisper of curses. And the king, still young, still unproven, stands in the center of the great chamber with his new bride, a foreign noblewoman whose bloodline comes with land but not loyalty. The solution? A rite. He is stripped, gently, ceremonially. His wife is dressed in veils, each one removed by a court official as a horn sounds in the courtyard. And then, before the eyes of the council, the clergy, and the nobility, they lie together on a raised bed draped in white linen. Not out of desire. Not out of love. But to summon rain. This was known. This was practiced. In Poland. In Old Saxony. In parts of northern France. The union was symbolic, meant to represent the marriage of heaven and earth. The king's seed became the rain. The queen's body, the soil. And the audience, silent and reverent, watched for signs. Sweat, moans, blood on linen. Each meant something. Each interpreted like a prophecy. But not all such rites were acts of unity. Some were punishments. Sexual humiliation was a form of justice. In the wake of rebellion, when a noble betrayed the crown or a knight defected to the enemy, it was not always the traitor who paid. His wife might be summoned to court. Forced to kneel naked before the court, adorned with chains of iron and thorns. Her hair shorn. Her womb declared spoiled by treason. In front of an audience, she would be symbolically exorcised, touched, inspected, and in some cases, raped not by men but by objects carved for the ritual. Wooden staffs dipped in wine and ash, engraved with the royal seal. It was a message: your body is no longer yours. Your body belongs to the king. Even queens were not exempt. If a consort displeased the court, if she failed to produce a male heir, or was rumored to have taken a lover, she might be sentenced to spiritual castration. A ceremony of enforced abstinence. Not simply a vow of chastity, but a punishment enacted upon the senses. She would be made to fast for days. Her bed stripped of sheets. Her chamber darkened. No flowers. No perfumes. A cold bath every morning, eyes cast to the floor, hands gloved so she could not feel warmth, skin, or fabric. A priest would stand at her door, reciting psalms meant for penance. And any attempt to resist, any moan in the night, any warming of the cheeks, was interpreted as a relapse. More fasting would follow. More stripping. Some women never recovered. They withered in their palaces, untouched until death. And in the countryside, far from the court, oath-sworn copulations continued in secret. At the base of sacred trees, where pagan gods had once been worshipped, couples knelt beneath twisted boughs and swore loyalty through union. Two bodies joined as a contract. A nobleman and a widow, a knight and his squire's sister, a merchant's daughter and a priest. The act itself was the vow. It had to occur outdoors. On soil. Under starlight or sun. Witnessed by the tree, never by man. And if the vow was broken, the curse fell fast: barrenness, madness, plague. That was the belief. These were not romantic acts. They were transactions. Performances. Sacrifices made not to please, but to prove. And in the shadows of every palace and every hut, one truth echoed. Sex was never just about bodies. It was about power. And power, when mixed with superstition, is a dangerous thing. If you entered a monastery library in the 14th century, you'd see rows of parchment, saints' lives, biblical commentaries, treatises on sin. But behind the chained tomes, in boxes marked with wax seals or wrapped in vellum stitched shut, lay other texts. Texts meant never to be read again. One of them was the Corpus of Flesh and Spirit. A manuscript rumored to have been rescued from an abbey fire in Brabant. Written by an unknown monk, it combined scripture with flesh. Each chapter began with a psalm, and ended with a position. To lie upon thy wife as Christ upon the church. To kiss her feet before her breast, for she is the temple made holy by touch. These were not lewd instructions. They were theological justifications for pleasure. The author believed climax, when mutual and sacred, brought the soul nearer to God. He was burned for heresy. His book survived only in fragments. Then there were the diagrams. Inquisitors catalogued them carefully when seizing heretical homes. Pages illustrated with lovers in robes, kneeling in prayer while joining bodies. Marginal notes suggested positions for certain sins, one for guilt, one for grief, one for purification after childbirth. Another banned text, now lost, was The Little Book of Honey and Ash. Said to be authored by a nun in the Rhineland, it was passed secretly among women. It contained instructions for preparing the body, not only for intercourse but for pleasure. Honey mixed with ground mint to stimulate sensation. Ash from burned fig leaves to cool inflammation. Diagrams drawn by hand, carefully folded and hidden between hymns. When it was discovered, the convent was dissolved. The abbess disappeared. The church justified the burnings by declaring these texts gateways to sin. But the people who wrote them were not rebels. They were seekers. Hungry for understanding in a world that feared flesh. We are not meant to read these texts. They were locked away, buried, destroyed. But now, through whispers, through fragments, through the margins of forgotten pages, they rise again. These pages burn so we'd never read them. If we're bringing them back to light, you know what to do. Hit subscribe. And if you won't, step into the comments and explain. Not every act of medieval intimacy was cloaked in shadows and secrecy. Some were conducted in the open, in marketplaces, at taverns, in the loud and dusty public squares where coins clinked, names were shouted, and reputations were sold for the price of a loaf of bread. In the heart of towns from Flanders to Florence, there existed a darker kind of economy, one measured not in weight, grain, or silver, but in bodies. Virgin auctions. You've heard of dowries. Of marriages arranged in courtrooms and parlors. But in poorer districts, where lineage held little meaning and girls were born with price tags, daughters were sold not just as wives, but as commodities of proof. On market days, girls as young as 12 were paraded through the square. Dressed in pale linen. Hair unbound to signify maidenhood. Buyers, men with coin or titles, sometimes priests, sometimes traders, placed their bids aloud. The higher the sum, the greater the promise. That the girl had not been touched, had not been kissed, had not even seen a man unclothed. Proof was demanded. And if a father could not provide it, the price dropped. Or worse, he paid a sex tax to the church. In some cities, bishops imposed a levy on any marriage contract that could not guarantee the virginity of the bride. A spiritual fine, they claimed. A penance. But the money never went to the poor. It went to the cathedral. And there were temple concubines, women kept by ecclesiastical authorities under different names, housekeepers, servants of the altar. They lived near chapels, dressed in simple robes, and bore children whose fathers were robed in red and gold. The church denied their existence. But the ledgers told the truth. Under the category of extra provisions, payments were made for cradles, milk, linens. Listed beside the names of priests. Marginal notes. To Brother Elias's household, for Sister Hildretha's medicine. Not all flesh was sold in silence. In guilds, especially among blacksmiths, butchers, and tavern keepers, sex-based fines were formalized. A journeyman who harassed a woman paid with coin, and with flesh. The punishment, public exposure, ritual spanking, or forced symbolic ejaculation. In certain taverns, when a fight broke out, the men involved were ordered to lie down, trousers down, while barmaids whipped them with fennel stalks dipped in ale. The act was watched. Laughed at. But it was not theater. It was ritualized humiliation, meant to remind the men that control of sex belonged to the guild, not the individual. And there was the first payment ritual, a hidden practice in some merchant families. When a marriage was agreed upon, the groom would enter a chamber alone and masturbate onto a cloth. The cloth was dried, folded, sealed in wax, and stored in the dowry chest. The symbolism. His seed had entered the contract. If he later denied consummation, the cloth would be retrieved, compared, displayed. Even now, centuries later, some of these practices echo in how we talk about bodies and debt, about purity and worth. The exchange never really ended. It only changed currency. What's the price of a name? A touch? A vow? And who decides what it's worth? Now imagine a night where the world turns inside out. Where peasants wear crowns and kings crawl on all fours. Where the priest whips the bishop. Where men become women and women become gods. This was no fantasy. It was carnival. And it was sacred. The festivals of carnal reversal were not mere feasts or drunken gatherings. They were deeply structured, ancient ceremonies. Disguised in laughter, wrapped in performance, but driven by forces older than doctrine. For one night, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, the rules dissolved. The beggar walked into the cathedral wearing a mitre. The bishop knelt in rags and kissed his feet. Status was undone. And with it, gender. Nuns shed their habits. They donned red paint, painted nipples onto their tunics, and walked the cloisters barefoot, inviting the monks to gaze upon their sinful flesh. The monks, bound by their roles, did not respond with silence or retreat. They responded with whips, symbolic at first, then harder, until skin flushed. It was not punishment. It was cleansing. Outside, in the streets, young men wore dresses. They lifted their skirts to show hairless legs covered in ash. Girls wore tunics and stuffed them with bread, mimicking the groins of men. They traded names. Traded roles. Sexual roleplay was central. Under bridges, by fountains, in alleyways, people reenacted confessions, a parody of church absolution. A woman, dressed as a priest, would call a man to her lap and ask him to confess his sins. He would list imagined transgressions. I looked upon my neighbor's wife, I spilled seed in sloth, and she would punish him with kisses or strikes, depending on the answer. Sometimes the act would turn real. Sometimes it was enough to pretend. The masks allowed it. No one could be punished for what happened behind a mask. That was the rule. Even the church observed it. Even the magistrate stayed silent. Because the chaos had meaning. It was believed that if the world was not turned upside down once a year, it would rot from the inside. That hierarchy, if never mocked, would poison the soul. That desire, if never played out in theater, would become violent in the dark. Carnival was the purge. The mirror. The warning. And though the morning always returned. With sermons, with apologies, with scrubbed streets and discarded costumes, the memory of the night remained. A reminder that even in the most rigid times, the body remembers its hunger. And sometimes, ritual is the only way to feed it without destroying everything else. In a world ruled by arranged marriages, religious control, and constant surveillance, love had no place. But still, it burned. It burned in the silence between glances, in the brief touch of hands beneath a table, in the midnight steps down the garden path. Love, real, reckless, consuming, was not permitted. And so, it hid. It became secret. It became magic. In the quiet corners of apothecaries, far from the clamor of the market, women whispered names they dared not speak aloud. They gave coins, not for healing, but for potions. Love potions. Recipes passed through generations in code. A strand of the beloved's hair, shaved down with a hot blade. A fingernail clipped during sleep. A scrap of cloth worn on the thigh. These were ground with herbs, cinnamon for desire, rosemary for loyalty, yarrow for obsession, and boiled in honey wine. Then the mixture was slipped into a cup. Or smeared on lips before a kiss. The result? They said he would stare. That he would dream. That he would ache with a hunger that only one touch could satisfy. But not all love potions were brewed in affection. Some were binding spells. Hexes designed not to inspire love, but to trap it. A wife, tired of her husband's wandering eyes, might visit a midwife in secret. She would bring a chicken heart, a piece of his underclothes, and the soil from beneath his side of the bed. These were combined and buried at the threshold of the home while incantations were whispered backwards. For as long as the charm remained in place, the man could not perform with another woman. And if he tried, he would suffer pain, humiliation, or madness. The church called it witchcraft. But for many women, it was insurance. Not all magic came in bottles. Some came in words. Love letters, real ones, were written under fear of death. Between a knight and a widow. A priest and a merchant's daughter. A noblewoman and a servant. These letters were never sealed with wax. Never signed. They were folded into linen, tucked into boots, passed through servants' hands. Some were written in invisible ink. Vinegar and urine, brushed lightly onto parchment, left no trace. But under heat, beneath a candle's flame, the words rose like ghosts. Whole pages of longing, confessions written by firelight, read only once, then burned. One such letter, recovered from the wall of a crumbled villa, read, "I kissed your name into the bread I ate, and I dreamed of you in my husband's arms." The letter was unsigned. But the grief was unmistakable. Even as priests preached against lust, even as kings married for land, the heart beat in secret. And the soul, caged by duty, still found ways to whisper. These potions, these letters, these spells, were acts of resistance. Because to desire, in a world that demanded silence, was to rebel. And if you're still listening, maybe you're one of them. Maybe you know that what they did wasn't foolish. It was brave. So don't scroll past their memory. Subscribe. Or go to the comments, and tell us why their whispers don't deserve to be heard. But the church heard those whispers too. And it responded, with silence first. Then with eyes. Then with records. You've heard of confession. But what was whispered in the darkness of a wooden booth didn't vanish into heaven. In some parishes, it was recorded. Catalogued. Traded. Priests, acting not as shepherds but as agents, took notes. On who was sleeping with whom, how often, in what positions. They called it spiritual accounting. But in truth, it was a ledger of control. These notes were cross-referenced with fines listed in the Codex Penitentium, a vast manual of sin and consequence. Masturbation during Lent. 5 days of fasting. Intercourse on a holy day. 2 silver coins. Oral sex within marriage. 15 lashes or a donation to the monastery. Each sin had a cost. And every payment went into the pockets of the church. The economy of sin grew. In towns where gossip ruled, entire families were interrogated. A daughter seen walking with a stranger. Her parents called before the bishop. Asked to testify. Did she bleed on her wedding night? Had she been seen alone with a cousin? Questions stacked like stones, until the truth didn't matter, only the fear. And sometimes, the watchers stepped inside. Church spies were embedded in brothels. They disguised themselves as confessors. As drunkards. As clients. They listened. Took names. Tracked movements. Women who once trusted the anonymity of darkness found themselves summoned before the magistrate, charged not with prostitution, but with seducing priests into sin. In one case, a girl of 17 was arrested after a spy reported that she had kissed a deacon and laughed. That was enough. She was imprisoned, branded, and exiled. In another, a man was sentenced for sleeping with his wife on a feast day. His neighbors reported the noise. The walls were thin. Privacy was treason. And sex, unless it was silent, sanctioned, and supervised, was taxed. In this economy, no one was free. Everyone paid. With coin. With skin. With silence. Now pause. Imagine. You are not watching this from the comfort of your bed. You are not scrolling with headphones in, safe behind a screen. No. You are in the year 1342. Your name is Margot. Or Ingrid. Or Alaric. You are 15. Or 30. Or 80. You were born beneath the same stars. But into a world that would rather own your body than hear your voice. Your first kiss was a sin. Your first touch, a contract. Your first love, a danger. Would you survive it? Would you lie to save your name? Bleed to protect your mother's pride? Drink the potion? Burn the letter? Hide the birthmark? Or would you rebel, and be punished? The people in these stories, they were not myths. They were not symbols. They were real. They lived. They breathed. They broke. And they tried to love in a world that called love a crime. Look around. You live in a time where you can choose who to touch. Who to kiss. Who to become. That freedom was not given. It was stolen from the silence of women who could not scream. From men who kissed in shadows. From children who were sold. From pages that burned. And still, somehow, the whispers survived. We are past whisper history. We speak what was never meant to be remembered. We listen where others forget. Now ask yourself, are you here to forget? Or to remember? Let the silence answer. Let the shadows speak. And let their names, however hidden, never be erased again.